we'll see how this. So yeah, I'll share my screen and yeah, again, I have a sort of a short PowerPoint, but then hopefully we have enough time um, to do some more discussion. Okay, so sorry, everybody can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I want to talk about this week then is I want to move on a little bit or sort of branch out a little bit from what we discussed last week. So last week we talked about one way to imagine the structure of agency from early Confucian and Daoist perspectives. And what I argued was that we could understand this as a situatedly reflective person. So the general idea was that uh, various contingencies, right, or particulars, interconnectedness, or communities, things like this, these don't only inform our agency, but actually provide the very structure of it. So this, of course, includes biological processes, right, and sort of the structure of being a human. So it's not to say that there's nothing sort of pre-given in some sense. But what is really meaningful for us has less to do with that and more to do, again, with various contingencies, especially those that we have experienced in our own sort of tradition or culture early on in our lives, and then that we're experiencing sort of as we do things in the world. So, what I want to talk about then today is sort of, again, extending from that or sort of branching off on that. I think that I'm not sure if we mentioned this in previous meetings, but the question of agency is actually sort of a bad question to ask early Chinese thought because it doesn't really appear. So, anytime that you discuss this, you have to sort of make up um, not only the question in a way that sort of makes sense to these texts, but you really have to make up your own answer. And what I want to then, so part of making up my own answer was what I did last week, right? That's sort of one way that you can think about it. But of course, there's many other ways that you can think about this because it's not a question native to these early texts. What I want to talk about today is then maybe a way that they or a different way of sort of understanding these texts, which then prioritizes a little bit less the questions that we commonly ask today. So that's what I did last week, right? I put the questions that we commonly ask today in the foreground, and then I tried to sort of develop a Confucian Taoist inspired response. Today, what I want to do is sort of foreground a little bit again, but still with a lot of flavor of contemporary sort of academic philosophical discussion. But what I want to do is sort of foreground a little bit concerns that might be more native to the text, or at least ones that I think we find as sort of stronger evidence for being prioritized within the text themselves. One thing, again, I honestly just finished this PowerPoint like 20 minutes ago. One thing I recognize that I didn't mention, but I'll mention now in case I forget later, is that the way to understand zhi or awareness, right, or knowledge sometimes, right, is just as awareness. And that's going to be very important for what I want to talk about today. So I gave this subtitle making the world obvious in better ways, because I think that that's one way that we can think about a common sort of thread found in these early texts. And this is has directly to do with the question of agency, although it doesn't necessarily respond or engage with the question in the way that we might see, for example, as we looked at last week in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or something like this. Okay, so just to rehearse very quickly, the three approaches that I presented last week, I discussed autonomy, or this idea that there's a power that's pre-given or independent of natural and social contingencies, and that this is something that's already endowed with a lot of meaning, right? So again, we can find this in Plato, in Augustine, or in Kant, certain readings of them at least. And the idea is that the sort of natural and social contingencies or the concreteness or particularness that we experience or that we even are in the world sort of gets in the way of us understanding better our own ability to understand things and to do things. So there's a pre-given or independent, not just structure or power of agency, but actually there's content along with that, right? And that's, for example, the point of the meno. I'm not sure if that was in one of the slides last week, right? But this whole idea of like knowledge as remembering, something like this. Um, then and there's a very strong, of course, understanding too, right? Then that everybody basically should understand things ideally in more or less the same way, right? Because we all sort of have this same pre-given, not just power, but also content. The second position, the one that is much more relatable to the position that I put forth last week, is this idea of the person as reflectively situated. So that exact terminology comes from Sandel, but there's a general sort of sharedness of this position in many, many thinkers, especially thinkers that we might consider Aristotelian. So again, we mentioned last week Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, Michael Sandel, Richard Rorty, Martha Nussbaum. These are all phenomenal, really fantastic thinkers that you can delve into on a whole number of topics. But they also share this sort of common thread where they think that there's some sort of power or capacity that's pre-given and outside of our natural and social contingencies. And that's where agency or our ability to choose comes from. So, again, the natural and social contingencies, right? These different particularities or concreteness, social ties, interconnectedness, things like this, communities. These things are very important for the content of agency or making choices, but not the structure of it. They might influence it to some extent, but not so significantly. And then the alternative to these two positions is the idea of sort of pure contingency. And this is the idea sometimes of the person as an aggregate, whatever, of social roles and of various contingencies. Again, this position is usually equated with determinism or fatalism, things like this. So, again, in response to some of the questions last week, just to isolate once again, but we already had this slide last week, this sort of intermediate position, Michael Sandel says, I do not think that the only alternative to a willing, sovereign, antecedently given self is the radically situated self, right? So again, this is the willing, sovereign, antecedently given self is the self of sort of autonomy. This is the first position that I put here, right, where meaning comes along with the self or the soul or whatever sort of power of choice. So he says it's not just that or the person or the self or agency as exhaustively defined by roles and social contexts, right? Or the language that I was using, contingencies, situatedness, uh, particularities, concreteness, things like this. He says because, and this is his rebuttal to the basically to the position that I was arguing for last week. If I were simply and only the product of my life circumstances, there would be no critical reflection or agency, right? And what I was trying to argue last week is that you can understand the person as merely a product of life circumstances and yet understand there being space to develop, right, through situatedness, through emergence, or both, a power of critical reflection. Again, it's not that you have a power of critical reflection that is then sort of the meaning of it is developed. It's that the very power itself or the very capacity itself, you can imagine this as being emergent or sedimented or both from purely life circumstances or contingencies. So again, this second position is the idea that there's a self. So there is a self, but it's reflectively situated, right? So again, the self sort of exists in some part structurally, regardless of life circumstances or thrownness or concreteness, what have you. But then a lot of the content should be directly tied to situatedness, right? So this is why it's reflectively situated. Okay, the position I put forth last week is the situatedly reflective person. So this is the idea that persons are an emergent foci of multifarious and incongruent contingencies, particularities, concreteness, interconnectedness, communities, etc. So these are, given their constant tensions, constantly cultivating or transforming one another, right? So this is also the idea that it's not just that we have or develop a power of reflection, but that this power of reflection also constantly changes, not just in its content, but also in its structure. Um, so the result, right, of this emergent foci of multifarious and incongruent contingencies can be a cogent self and a strong sense of agency. So we do have this feeling of a self or this understanding of identity, and we also have the experience of autonomy or agency of making choices, right? And probably maybe we also actually make them. Um, Again, agency then is seen as an emergent necessity generated from both internal and external multifarious and incongruent contingencies. So, one way to read early Confucianism, but we can also throw Taoism in here. We can talk about that more in the Q&A, is as suggesting that people can have quite a strong sense of agency and something that might qualify as something like autonomy without having to source a power or structure that's pre-given or that's outside of contingencies. So, this might be a little bit difficult to imagine, I think, sometimes, this idea of having these multifarious and incongruent contingencies, and then how this agency might be an emergent necessity. So I think something that might help us understand this is that identity is perhaps a more apparent or obvious example of an emergent necessity generated, again, both from the internal and external contingencies or the multifarious and incongruent contingencies that constitute who we are. So, identity, in terms of how we make sense of ourselves or understand ourselves, others, interactions, and the world at large, is something that we construct and something that we continually reconstruct, right? You might even have this experience sometimes of sort of losing a sense of who you are, right? And often, interestingly enough, it's usually through interacting with other people that you sort of tend to gain that sense back. But that sense of self is usually something like a story or a narrative or whatever that you're sort of telling yourself. So it relies heavily, again, on the recognition of others. It relies heavily on social roles. And today it relies, in some parts of the world, for some people, on different visions or versions of authenticity, right? Understandings of authenticity can be very, very useful for people to develop their identity. We might still criticize that, right, Michael? But it's something that people do use. And then profile based, right, or sometimes called branding yourself, right, referred to like this. Profile based demands also change a lot and give a lot of meaning to identity. So there's three sort of really broad ways in which we are all multifarious and incongruent. Our bodies are composed of multifarious and incongruent systems. And the function of those systems is also multifarious and incongruent, right? Our bodies are constantly regulating themselves. Some of the most obvious examples of this are autoimmune diseases, but your body already, right, is doing tons of things, sort of going in one direction, some things going in another direction, and these are not harmonious all the time, right? It's doing all these different things, and these can be incongruent. Our thoughts and feelings are also, I would say, if you're honest with yourself, maybe they're probably always multifarious and incongruent, right? I certainly enjoy having this class and also wish I could just go home and not have this class right now. Um, and you feel this all the time, I think, about most things that you do, about people that you interact with, etc., right? There's not a sort of clean, I just like this and no, I don't like something about it. There's not even a clean, again, I think if you're really honest with yourself, I don't like this. right? And there's nothing I like about it. And again, that holds true for various experiences and also people we interact with, things like this. And then perhaps, I mean, with the bodies, I think it's also very, very obvious, but maybe for some people, the most obvious is social roles, positions, or personas that we have, right? These are always in constant conflict, in constant tension, and sometimes even contradict one another, right? So I have to prepare for class today, but I also have all these master's theses I have to read. I also, I have tons of different other work, right? So, and these are all basically social personas related to professor. If I bring in other ones, Demetra came to Shanghai today. I wish I could have gone and hung out with her, but I had to prepare for class and read master's dissertations, right? These are all, that one's not so much a mini tragedy, that's a big tragedy. But right, we sort of constantly, these different personas that we have, these different social roles, etc., they're in conflict, right? They're multifarious and then necessarily incongruent as well. Um, but nevertheless, right, we do develop a sense of identity, right? This emerges from all of these different multifarious and incongruent aspects of who we are. So, and then, of course, if we look at how these relate to one another, right, bodies, thoughts, feelings, personas, then it becomes even more complex, right? And we're just this giant mess. And it's sort of a wonder that we're able to put together something like an identity, right? And to make sense of ourselves and to make sense of other people. But it's necessary because if we somehow tried to go along with all these different things, it just wouldn't be possible, right? And so we have to come up with something, and I think it makes sense to think about it as emergent and a lot of times also as sedimented, right? Depending on, again, sort of how people view us and things like this, ways to make sense of ourselves. Otherwise, we just couldn't function. So, I think identity is something that's necessary then, right? So the identities that we construct emerge from this mess of various multifarious and incongruent stuff. I don't know what else to call it, that makes us us. Um, it's necessary for a sense of identity to emerge. Otherwise, we would just have no way of making sense of ourselves, of other people, of our interactions, or of the world in general. And I think we can think of agency and morality, but we'll save that for another time or never, as similarly emergent and necessities required to deal with other messes of multifarious and incongruent stuff, right? I think when reflecting on early Chinese thought, probably agency, the idea of agency and the idea of person, both of which are basically alien concepts, we can probably put those together a lot. So whatever we say for one, I think will bleed into the other to a significant degree. Okay, so now I want to go through some more recent scholarly work that might help us think about other ways that we can uh, talk about related concerns related to agency in early Chinese thought, and make it make a lot more sense than it might otherwise would. So, in recent years, there's been a lot of scholars from various different disciplines that have renewed challenges to ways of thinking about agency that prioritize abstract reason, a self or a soul, or something in us, which can neutrally adjudicate between an array of options. So, this was Michael's favorite, what is it, the rational theory? What is it again? Rational choice theory, something like this? Yeah. So Michael's favorite theory, right? We're actually, sorry, Michael, we're going to try to attack that a little bit today. Um,
Oh, please, no.
So I don't think that these discussions are new in any sense. So obviously you can find discussions like these in Freud and Nietzsche and Buddhism, and probably I think most ways of thinking. I think rather it's this agency that prioritizes abstract reason and a self or a soul or something that can neutrally adjudicate. I think that this is more of the minority view. In certain places and in the circles that we run in today, uh, this is usually the majority view. but I think historically and looking at different places in the world, and especially non-academics, I think and especially non-Western or weird people, right? This acronym, then I think that this is not a sort of new way of thinking about things at all. Okay, so one scholar we can look at, neurologist or neuroscience. Yeah, I think he does neuroscience and then also biology. Is
Neurobiology, yes.
yeah, yeah. Robert Sapolsky. So in his 2017 book, Behave, he describes how various biological processes influence human behavior on scales ranging from less than a second before to an action to thousands of years before, right? So basically, his idea is that our behaviors are influenced by a multitude of factors, including sort of neurological processes or chemicals, environment and sensory stimuli, hormones, genetics, etc. In a more recent book, I think it was published in 2023, he's gone a little bit more philosophical, and he's actually argued that we don't have any free will. So he argues for a more deterministic view of human behavior. He says there is no free will, or at least that there is much less free will than is generally assumed when it really matters. So his argument is that human actions are determined by neurobiology, hormones, childhood, and life circumstances. So he generally concludes that our choices are determined by our genetics, by our experience, and by our environment. So any sort of use of the word free will is probably erroneous, according to Sapolsky. Okay. Daniel Kuhlman is, I think, Michael, you would be familiar with his work for sure, right? Yeah. He wrote this incredibly famous or influential book, Thinking Fast and Slow. He also won a Nobel Prize in economics. And we're going to use a little bit of his terminology today. I think there's three thinkers that I'm presenting. One is Sapolsky, the next is Kalman, and the third is Haidt. And the three of them, I think we can sort of trace some similar themes, and we'll try to borrow these to make sense of some concerns in early Chinese thought. So this in Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel explains the complexity of human decision making, unveiling two cognitive systems. So we have a more intuitive system, or system one, and a more analytic system, or system two. So this intuitive system, or system one, is fast, it's automatic, it's guided by intuitions, and it helps us make sort of snap or quick judgments. System two is slower, it's deliberate, and it is able to crunch or to think about complex problems. And so he tries to, and he argues, I think, very well, that we can see profound effects of these two different systems in sort of everything that we do. And we often think that we're working with system two, but most of the time we're actually working with system one. So most of the time we're making decisions without really thinking about much, relying on whatever prejudices, biases, um, certain emotions, feelings, intuitions, etc. And then every once in a while, we encounter something that we really need to think about, and then that's sort of when system two kicks in. Or sometimes somebody asks us about what we've done, and then we use system two to sort of explain something that was done with system one. So just to go over them again, system one is fast. That's the best way you can think about it. It operates automatically and almost involuntarily, or sometimes completely involuntarily. It is unconscious. Sometimes it can't be stopped, and it runs continuously. We apply it effortlessly and intuitively to everyday decisions, right? So when we drive, when we walk, when we drink water, when we think about our age, when we interpret a facial expression, actually, it's hard to even consciously think about how you're interpreting facial expressions, right? You actually don't know. You do it, it's not something you can usually access. And there's sort of much more emotion here. And I think it's much more prevalent than if you just sort of think about how many automatic or involuntary things you did today. Actually, System 1 covers those things and a lot more things that you probably are less likely to think System 1 covers. So the second system is slow. It's only called upon when necessary to reason, to compute, to analyze, or to solve problems, right? So again, we don't use this very often. We probably don't use this when we're choosing like which bottle of water to drink. We probably don't use this when we're having most conversations with people. Again, sort of most of what we do all day is heavily relying on System 1. Um, System 2 can correct or confirm judgments in System 1, but it takes a lot of effort. It's a more reliable system in some sense, or it does things that when we use reason, when we explain to other people and such, it does things that we like more, basically, but it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes concentration. So again, it's not something that we engage in very often. It's much more rational in many senses. But again, you see with this image on the side here that maybe it takes up, 10% of our day or something like this or less. This is another image that I found that can be useful, right? So again, this System 1 or fast thinking continually scans the environment. It's very fast, but errors can be made. It works automatically and effortlessly. There's a lot of shortcuts, impulses, and intuitions. And also, by the way, of course, we need this, right? You could never function without this at all. You need all these, otherwise, you would just be whatever, relearning how to walk every day. And then again, System 2 is used for specific problems and only if necessary. It takes effort to analyze, reason, and solve complex problems and to exercise self-control. Again, it's slow, but maybe reliable in some senses. Um, he has another book, which he did with two other authors called Noise, where they talk a little bit more about cognitive biases, differences in skill, differences in tastes, emotional reactions, mood, levels of fatigue, group dynamics, and how all of these things are very, very influential for making judgments. Again, much more than we think. You can even find great evidence. He did this in both books, right? With how judges in courts, right? Again, people we think would constantly be using System 2 are actually using System 1 all of the time. And that again, their judgment is heavily influenced in, I think in particular, he looked at just them being hungry, right? So before lunch or after lunch, how likely you are to get parole or something like this. And the numbers are um, very convincing. Let's put it this way. So, and you can do this again with all sorts of things. I mean, McDonald's does it with the color within the restaurant, right, to make you eat faster. Anyways, you can find tons and tons of cognitive science uh, where you see interesting related experiments. Okay. And then the last thinker I want to look at is Jonathan Haidt. I'm not sure what his, uh, I should have looked this up. I mean, he's does a little bit more philosophy, I think also cognitive science. He does a few different things. So he's demonstrated that people's beliefs are primarily driven by intuition, with reason operating mostly to justify beliefs that are more intuitively obvious. So he also he talks a lot about religion, right, and politics. So he talks also about moral volitions, how this is something more like preferences. And he talks about how people act in more sort of group-ish ways and are less sort of individual thinkers than we often think. So one of his key arguments is related to this rationalist delusion. So this is the idea that the unconscious mind really determines the direction or orientation that we take. And we sometimes think with our more rational way of thinking that we have made decisions either as they're being made or sometimes after they're being made. So again, I think you can see probably some connection between Sapolsky, Kalman, and Haidt in terms of um, arguing that there's different that we're much less rational, we're much less deliberative, we're much less sort of involved, actually consciously in making decisions than we often experience and probably than we often would like to admit. Just as an aside, Haidt also wrote a book a couple years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, The Anxious Generation. It's really interesting. It's about social media, and then I just put up some other related books if you're interested. Okay, so to go back to this question of the reflectively situated versus the situatedly reflective person, before we get into this sort of system one, system two thinking related to Chinese philosophy. So again, the reflectively situated person has the power or capacity, or sorry, this here, the power or capacity of reflection is given prior to experience, right? So agency then is somehow sourced from something otherworldly or outside of contingencies. There's usually a primacy of reason in a pure sense. So then emotions, intuitions, and the like should be subordinate to reason, right? And I think also you can see the continuity or the discontinuity between this and what we were just talking about with those three authors. And then everyone's primary capacity or power of reflection is basically the same in some sense. And situatedness or contingencies only informs reflections. It can alter it in terms of content and maybe make some sort of loose adjustments to its structure, but again, it's primarily in terms of the content. The reflectively situated person, I think, is much more in agreement with the three authors that we just looked at. So, this is the idea that the capacity or power of reflection emerges from contingencies. So, agency is always this worldly, again, in structure and in content. Reason, emotions, intuitions, and the like have similar value to one another, right? And then this can be context dependent, also can just depend on sort of what we want. People think, feel, judge, and make choices in ways that can be fundamentally different from one another, right? So it's not just the content of our choices that separate how we make choices, but it's actually how we make the choices. So, situatedness itself is what gives rise to reflection, and it determines both the content and the structure. And then I think another way to think about this is some of the differences between the situatedly reflective person or some of the sort of consequences of this is just to try to use this metaphor, right? When you think, feel, judge, decide, make choices, and act, right? If you actually try to use this, I think you'll find a different type of argument, right? So I think it's useful or sort of seeing the differences is especially clear when you are interacting with people you disagree with, when you feel upset, or even when you feel sometimes maybe too happy, right? So it's largely a different sort of metaphor, right? So I'm not necessarily arguing that it's the most accurate representation of what we really are, but it's also has a function in just the way that we then think about ourselves and other people as a metaphor in and of itself. Okay, so the world interactions, I think, in yourself will become different and everything will unfold differently if this is your model or if this is your guiding metaphor. And this bleeds directly into what I want to say about early Chinese thought. Okay, so um, if we think about being a nice person, or if we think about being nice in general, I think there's two sort of ways, two very general ways in which we can think about this. One is we can think about being nice is something that someone can do. So I exist. I decide that I want to be nice to Michael. I know that Michael likes chocolate covered coffee beans. So I decide I want to be nice to Michael. So I will buy him chocolate covered coffee beans. That's one way.
I really like this example. Yes.
So I think that's one way for us to think about how people are nice. Another way is that being nice is a comportment to the world, right? Or basically, there's a way of being in the world. There's a way that the world unfolds. So there's a way that the world is obvious. And you might understand the world in such a way, and you might do things in such a way, and then someone might call that nice. But you don't think to yourself, this would be a nice thing. You would think perhaps somewhat differently, just, oh, Michael likes coffee beans, and here are some coffee beans. Maybe I'll buy them. Or Michael likes chocolate covered coffee beans and is running out. Maybe it would be fun to drive around and try to find some. Right? That this is, I mean, this is a different way, again, just a sort of metaphor image, but it's a different way to think about how we think about who people are or different values or decisions that people make. And I think a lot of these things that we sort of like are ineffable in some sense, right? So we might try to seeing examples of someone being nice, let's say, we might try to then isolate what we call nice and try to figure out what exact qualities go along with this, and then determine some sort of general rule or general definition, right? And then say, well, if you would like to be nice, you need to do this, right? That is one way that we can do things. But I think a lot of the things that we really like or enjoy are not easily dissected in this way, or that when we do this, to some extent, we ruin them. Um, a lot of what we admire, like, or enjoy about someone is often not what they do through deliberation, right? It's not what they sit there and decide, I should do X, I should do Y, I should do whatever, because this would be whatever, but it's how the world makes sense to them. It's how the world unfolds to them. It's what's sort of obvious in the world, and it's how they act according to that that attracts us or that makes us like someone, right? So, and this is also sort of obvious in some way because uh, it's also often not the things that you readily recognize in yourself as whatever particular qualities that people enjoy about you, right? And vice versa, of course. There's tons of textual support for this in early Chinese classics. Oh shit, I'm running out of time, so I'll go a little bit quicker. In the Mengzi, right, just this idea, 有人一行，非心人意也, right? So this is just acting from this, right? And sort of instead of trying to act it. In the Lunyu, you have a couple lines, but again, I'll just go very quickly. 无可而无不可, or 人能弘道，非道弘人. So this is both of these ideas are ideas that you sort of that the things that we like, there's nothing sort of fixed about them, and that we generate or produce them, not that we follow something else. In the Zhuangzi, you have tons and tons of related language. Ziqu is probably the most radical. You have yin shi, yi ming, yi hu tian li. So yin shi and yi ming are the most obvious, but we could do it with the other ones. The shi that you go by are the things, again, that you sort of see that makes sense to you for whatever reason. Yi ming, going by what is obvious. Again, what's obvious for you, for you, for you is not obvious for me, right? So what's obvious for different people is different. And the idea is to go by what is obvious for whatever reason. And then in the Tao Te Ching, you can do the same thing with Dao Ke Dao Fei Cheng Dao, right? Or Shang De Bu De, Shi Yi You De. Okay. We also have, I think, a really nice expression of this in Wang Bi's introductory essay to the Tao Te Ching. So he writes here that if great love completely lacks selfishness, how then could a special designation for it exist? The utmost good has no preference. How then could its name or definition be generated? The people use or make use of it daily and do not know how it is, what it is. How could it possibly be named? How could we possibly use language to describe this? Um, and I think that some of the things that we care about the most in some sense, right? Someone who's a real friend, someone who's reliable, trustworthy, caring, or nice, things like this. These are things that I think are most accurately described by what Bong B says here. Um, Even something like reliable or trustworthy, which we usually think we can come up with a definition, When we really, I think if we're sort of open to how this operates in a more obvious sense, then we understand that we can't really define these things, right? Because being reliable, trustworthy, but especially being a friend or being caring are things that are not easily defined. And again, I think when we try to define them, we would more tend to harm them, right? Because then we would ask that you think about this external thing, right? And then try to go by that rather than going by some of these other ideas that we find in early Chinese texts. Um, so in the Analects 1.2, right, I think everybody's very familiar with this passage as well. I just will read the highlighted section here. Exemplary persons concentrate their efforts on the root. For the root having taken hold, the way will grow therefrom, right? So the idea is that you're going to somehow cultivate the root of things, and then you will grow, right, into, or you will help grow the way somehow in yourself, in your interactions, and in the world. Wang Bi's comment to this says that natural or 自然 love is taken as filial or xiao. Extending love is taken as humaneness, right? So again, his concentration here is that it's something more ineffable. We give it names and we give it designations and we try to sort of map out what it is later, but the thing itself is not something that we can put into language. So again, just 道可道非常道, something like this. Um, so in these early texts, right, we have oftentimes discussions of things like self-cultivation or also 体会, something like experiencing or embodying. We usually think that we're supposed to memorize these texts, right? We're supposed to read a lot of different stuff and basically memorize it. And also this memorization, we then sort of go out in the world with this, see what works, see what doesn't work, etc. And also we whatever should sometimes learn rituals or sometimes maybe even learn uh well, with the memorization of the text, you have learning of key phrases, things like this, or unlearned rituals. I think that these all speak to and are methods of training something more automatic, more spontaneous, more 自然, more wu wei, responses or comportments to the world. So they're less guidelines for how to think, and they are less about giving us advice of particular points to consider, methods for judgment, or advice for action. So, in Kalman's language, this is all about training our system one, the fast system. And it's not about things that we think about so much with system two. That doesn't mean you never think about it with system two, right? But the ultimate goal has very little to do with system two. And even in the practice, whatever, of learning rituals or unlearning rituals, right? There's a lot of reference to and reliance on system one. And this is in the texts themselves, right? They don't give you system two arguments, and they don't think of you as primarily a system two type of person, right? So the idea is that they're sort of transforming the idea is to transform somehow the root of who you are and not the sort of extra thinking that you add on later. Um, so again, if we start from situatedness, right, the situatedly reflective person, and we never think we're giving advice or discussing how to deliberate, think, calculate, or reflect from some neutral starting point, right? So the text doesn't think you're starting from somewhere neutral either, very obviously. Then we imagine that people always have things that they like, things that they value, and ways that the world makes sense or unfolds to them. Reading the classics and memorizing them and experiencing them is a way to orient or to reorient people in ways that are more conducive to, and then it sort of depends a little bit on the text, maybe like following Dao, something like flourishing, Li Xiang Renge, sometimes used in modern Chinese. This will really depend also on how you read the text. But then what is obvious, or the way that the world makes sense to us, is what these texts are primarily aimed at transforming, right? What they want to do is just make us into people who sort of automatically see the world in certain ways, respond in certain ways. Again, sometimes the system, sometimes you're going to have a lot of sort of deliberation, right? Then you're going to think about certain models, maybe you think about certain sayings, but always, I think these texts think we're doing this not in a way where we imagine we're somehow lifted out of our circumstances, right? So even when we're doing this more sort of system two type of thing, they're asking us to really pay attention to feelings, intuitions, etc., because these have already been cultivated, right? We've already sort of focused on the root. So we might think of something very sort of rationally, very slowly, very not very reliably, that our bodies, our intuitions, our feelings tell us maybe isn't the best way to do things, right? And I think that that's um, very important to all of these early texts. And interestingly, most academic philosophy today is not oriented this way at all, right? It's just exclusively sort of system two. It's just going to tell you rationally how you should think about things. Again, as if you sort of start from this neutral point, as if emotions, intuitions, etc., are just not important, right? They might influence you, but that's too bad, right? You should do your best not to be influenced by them. And there's certainly, I would say, basically no concentration on trying to uh, cultivate or influence or orient this system one, right? This faster sort of reactive way that we have in the world. Okay, so I'm gonna skip these two slides again for the second time because I know, Michael, you have to go in 10 minutes. So thanks, everyone. And sorry for a somewhat rushed presentation that was not very well prepared.
Wow, that was fantastic.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Completely
Wow.
brilliant. Completely,
Mind blowing.
truly. This is wonderful.
No, yeah, I think I need a couple more weeks on this, but yeah.
No,
This, not you, not you. Don't take it personally, you know?
James,
This. Incredible, incredible. Very, very, very good idea, Paul. Amazing.
incredibly exciting. And one quick question before we turn to the other questions,
yeah,
but just to focus on the philosophically significant issue. In the two scenarios of how to read someone being or think of someone being nice, either way, I still get the chocolate covered espresso beans, correct?
Only if they have them at the
I mean, let's
store.
focus on the philosophically key
Yeah,
question.
yeah. Only if they're at the store, right? It's all about contingencies, you know? You're thinking too ideally. This is too abstract, Michael. This is far too abstract. You didn't learn anything from all the we've been talking about Chinese philosophy. You learned nothing.
It's
That's the
important to
most
focus on the
incredible and
really key
amazing thing.
issues.
You didn't learn anything. Incredible and amazing.
No, the lesson is, yeah, you still get the coffee beans, and Paul still gets to brag about being nice, you know? That's the bottom line of all
He
this.
didn't get them. He didn't get them. I mean, that was the actual experience. No comment.
But truly, this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Incredibly exciting.
Yeah. If you have to leave, when you have to leave, Michael, just leave. It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I've got a few more minutes though.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
James, I
let's
have
go to the
James
question.
and Jonah, then Angela on my screen.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Paul, for the talk. So, just more of a hopefully helpful comment. So I'm wondering if we couldn't approach the topic from another angle that is maybe less scientifically rigorous, but like is kind of also super grounded, I think, in intuition, which is Susan Wolf's Moral Saints work, right? So, like for those who are unfamiliar, Susan Wolf is saying like, okay, so you've got a saint, right? Someone for whom like morality is the highest value, either because they just love behaving in moral ways, and so that outcompetes all other, they have no other love, or because they love other things like playing tennis or listening to jazz and so on, but their love for morality outcompetes all of those things. And like the general point of our paper is, thank God, like no one you know is like this, right? I wouldn't wish this on anybody, right? And so how this relates to like what you've discussed today is like, if we think of rationality not just as like faculty or a power, but all as like a value, right? Then like arguably you could have the rational saint, right? Someone for whom rationality as a value is either something that's their only desire, or it outcompetes all other desires. And thank God you're not like that. Thank God no one is like that. You wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy, right? And I think that it would keep a lot of the consequences of what you've discussed today, because it sort of speaks to the fact that, like, look, I don't need a rational reason to love jazz or to love tennis and things like this. And so I'm just kind of throwing that out there as maybe like a helpful angle.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I completely agree. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's I don't know if you like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, that was the idea, right? You know the backstory of Sherlock.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Mm.
So, but yeah, so I completely yeah, thanks. That's exactly sort of the avenue that I want to go down. Exactly. Yeah. Jonah?
Yeah, thanks for this. This is yeah, still super interesting. I'm wondering, my question is about like where this is, like to what extent this is found in the texts, and because I'm wondering, like you said that, the model of agency that you want to develop and defend is one in which there's no fixed content, nor is there any fixed structure of agency. And that made me think that maybe you could read like the four sprouts in human nature in Mengzi as like fixed content, or at least like starting, antecedent content that's universal among human beings. And maybe you could read like, the structure of the person where the heart is like the Lord and the sense organs are the ministers in Xunzi as another like fixed structure of agency, that then gets like different, we have the bad some starting content and then we can change that content. I'm wondering what you think about that and where that goes with the other things you said about the text.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that there is, I mean, there's always going to be, I think, some starting sort of content or structures, right? But they're going to be much looser, I think, than some of the ways that the more intermediate position imagines them. And I think the other sort of key difference is that what's most meaningful to us are not so much those starting structures, but what we do, which is oftentimes I think more of these structures are sort of we're blind to them, right? These starting structures. So when we try to tease them out, we sort of often just get some aspect of it or some sort of angle on it. Bye, Michael, no problem. But it doesn't. I don't think it serves us too much to try to concentrate a ton on this because we're always going to be operating according to it. So a lot of times. Focusing more on those shifts or the sort of changing things, which I think constitute much more of the issues that were sort of are meaningful for us, that this is more where the focus should be. I think we get ahead of ourselves sometimes when we try to come up with a more sort of fixed structure and say everybody sort of makes decisions like this, and now let's sort of try to fill it out. The ones that you mentioned, I think, are relatively loose, right? And I think that so I think that they are helpful in many ways to think. And I also think that's sort of the virtue of this type of approach, which is exactly sort of what you're emphasizing, right? Is that they're very sort of loose structures that we can do a lot of different things with.
Okay, thanks. So you're thinking maybe that like maybe there's some kind of fixed content and structure. It's just not going to be terribly important for practical purposes since it can be kind of filled out and changed in different ways. And when we want to focus on like what is changeable,
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
that
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, and I think that this what is sort of relatively fixed is much again sort of much looser than what is what you find is sort of fixed, for example, in these Aristotelian thinkers today, right? What they see as fixed is much more sort of rigid, it's much more universal. And I think that it doesn't always serve us very well to focus on that, right? And that the things that are more interesting, again, are these sort of changeable things, or at least imagined as changeable.
Yeah, okay. Cool. Now this just offhand, I've been reading I'm in a like an Nicomachean ethics reading group right now, and like I'm repeatedly reminded of ways in which Aristotle is different from his contemporary champions. And
Yeah.
I wonder if this is like the way in which he is, or he might be more on the side of the Confucians than, the people who have taken up his banner today. But that
Yeah,
could be
yeah, yeah.
explored.
No, that's why I don't speak about Aristotle himself, because
Sure, yeah.
I don't really concentrate that much on Aristotle. The contemporary Aristotelians, I'm much more comfortable talking about them. But Aristotle also, there are other things that are very important for him, right? So, I mean, we could do this would be like a different whole class or whole semester, right? But something like phronesis, right, which is you don't really have, I mean, it doesn't have to be that important for early Confucian texts, right? That at different ages you can have different things are sort of fine, right? There's not one, it's not that you have to mature in order to really express whatever, right? So I think there's tons of room for really productive like similarities, but or noticing productive similarities, but I think we should, but this has been done a lot, and I think sometimes it's sort of overdone, because one of the things that it does, which is problematic, right, is um, you go to, and this is sort of often what people who do Chinese philosophy or Chinese thought are doing, especially in comparative context, right? So you have some professor, let's say at NYU, not Shanghai, NYU, New York, right? Who doesn't know anything about Chinese thought. And you say, oh, yeah, well, I can sort of introduce you to Mencius through Aristotle, right? And then so what you do is you sort of teach them that Mencius is kind of like Aristotle. Mencius always sort of never lives up to Aristotle, right? And then immediately the way that the conversation is going is you basically know Aristotle. You basically know Mencius. He just does some things that are kind of different than Aristotle, right? And when you talk to scholars who are actually curious, right, or actually interested, they don't want to hear that. They're not that interested in those similarities, right? Like, for example, Michael Sandel himself, he's not that interested in similarities between Aristotle and Confucius or Mencius. He thinks they're boring, right? What he's interested is like, give me Confucius qua Confucius, in a more Confucian way, right?
For sure.
And so I think that a lot of scholars think for whatever reasons that trying to make the Shunzi, the Zhuangzi, whatever text, right, related to Western thinkers will make it somehow more attractive. But I think that this is counterproductive for many reasons. So not that it's not great to notice these similarities, right? I mean, there's tons of similarities, and they can be very productive. But I think some of our job should be to not emphasize this so much. Look at some of the differences, and from the differences, you create sort of a platform where you can then present these thinkers more like in their own right with their own concerns, etc.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. Angela? Yeah.
Well, I have two questions. The first is for the quick thinking or the situationally reflective. I wonder in certain environment and at a certain second, ourselves has one feeling, one thought, or have multiple. Yeah, for the theory of free will, at least it ensures that myself will have one single rational thought at the moment. But if we just how to say negotiate or with others or interact with the environment, we may have multiple thoughts and feelings at the same time. And these thoughts and feelings may conflict with each other. It seems that it is still not a harmonious state. Another question is that maybe the slow thinking pattern or the reflective situated pattern still has its values. Yeah, I have two reasons. The first is from Xunzi, because he thinks that if we let people respond to their environment, we don't have any social norms. They will always pursue for personal interest, and this will lead to wars or some serious disorders. So we should set up some basic social norms. Another thing is, in contemporary world, people with different cultural background may live in the same society, and their previous experience will influence their current reflection to something. Yeah, let's say one thing happened in this society, and people from different cultures they react differently. But these different reactions may also lead to some disorder. Yeah, these are my two questions.
Yeah. No, I think I sort of accept all of these points, and I think that I was trying to include similar points in the discussion today. So, as you said, like these multiple thoughts and feelings, I think are happening all the time, and they're not harmonious, right? This is what this idea of sort of incongruous tries to highlight. The but I wasn't so the idea was that these two sort of systems, right? Which again, we don't have to sort of hold on to them as such distinct systems. This has sometimes been criticized. But I think that they're good sort of ways of thinking about how we think or react, make choices, etc., behave. These don't map on to the situatedly reflective person and the reflectively situated person, right? So you can use so both the situatedly reflective person, the argument would be is comprised of both of these systems, and as well as the reflectively, or the opposite of whatever one I just said. This one is also sort of comprised of both of these systems. So I think what you say can hold true for either of these different ways of conceptualizing the person. Okay. I think we can maybe, Dimitra, we can stop here for today.